Hello, everybody. Today is day 311, and we are reading from Matthew chapter 19 and Mark's Gospel chapter 10. The Pharisees loved controversy, and they especially loved trying to trip Jesus up. Now, there are those who just seem to like all kinds of just stress and a good fight, and they enjoy the drama. But these Pharisees especially did, and they were motivated by the fear that they were losing their power and their position because the masses were running to Jesus. Well, they were looking for ways of which they could somehow trip Jesus up. And so they would go after things that were difficult topics that would cause that kind of conflict and possibly would enable them to expose Jesus as a fraud. So the Pharisees came to Jesus and they're testing him. And they open up this hot topic. It's a hot topic because even to this day, it continues to be a hot topic. Is it right, they ask, for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? So Jesus forces them to define what the law says, specifically as it pertains to Moses. What did Moses tell you? They said to him, well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce. This allowed Jesus now an opportunity to take these crafty Pharisees back to God's original design for marriage. First of all, he said, Jesus shows them that sin and the hardness of man's heart is what causes the symptoms and the results of divorce. Secondly, he says that marriage or divorce violates God's original design. It's not what God had intended. Thirdly, Jesus takes them back to God's original intent, that law of first mention, which is of great significance when we're just trying to determine any thing as to what God's belief is about something or what his expectation is, to go back and see in its original design or that first mention. Fourthly, we see that Jesus gives us this exception clause as it pertains to divorce, except for what's called moral issues such as sexual infidelity. Now, God's definition of marriage through Jesus gives here is remarkable. And this is what I believe. So many times we miss this because we fumble around at the definition here or reason or clauses for divorce. First of all, he gives us a definition here of what marriage is. Number one, it's between a man and a woman. When people suggest to us that Jesus never addressed the issue of homosexuality, we can point to this passage and say, oh, yes, he did, because he makes it crystal clear what the definition of marriage is, and it is not between same sexes. He said that God created a man and a woman. He intended marriage to be between a man and a woman. Secondly, he specifically defines two absolute genders. There's no muddy waters here of multiple dozens or even 100 different gender possibilities. Jesus specifically says a man and a woman. And that reinforces to us the clarity of God's original design. Thirdly, he illustrates clearly here the supernatural mystery and beauty of the marriage union. He describes it as one flesh, two coming together, a man and a woman coming together and becoming one flesh. And in it, he describes his intent, the original design in the permanence of marriage, that it was intended to be a lifelong journey. And that's the reason to let no man separate it. So it's clear that God's original design is the permanence of marriage. And then finally, it beautifully characterizes the eternal union of Christ and his church. And this is mentioned in the book of Revelations, and that which you and I will enter into in the coming of Christ. But obviously, this discussion greatly troubled the disciples. You see, if you're saying, well, maybe we're not quite understanding what Jesus was saying here, and it's lost in translation, and so maybe some of these edges are a little too sharp or more sharpened than what they were originally intended. Well, I'll tell you one way that we can determine that it has not been lost in translation is the response of the disciples. Because when Jesus clarifies the definition of marriage and the laws pertaining to the permanence of marriage, the disciples are deeply troubled. And because of his definition, and that was unquestionably clear, they even say, well, then a man maybe should never marry. And so this makes it clear that we may not like it. And I'm only speaking what the Bible, what Jesus is clearly defining here. So first of all, marriage is supernatural. It's created by God. Secondly, marriage is beautifully designed for our satisfaction and our joy and pleasure. And thirdly, marriage is hard, and it's hard because of sin and rebellion. And that's what Jesus talks about here, that it was not intended, but because of sin, because of the hardness of heart. And it's sin, selfishness, that gets into the way of the marriage union. And then finally, it demands grace and the power of God. You see, it's evident here that because this is supernatural in its origin, you and I also need to experience it in a spiritual or supernatural realm. You cannot, and I cannot do this without the grace and the power of God. It is a sacred and supernatural picture of Christ and his marriage to us, the bride of Christ. You see, when Jesus returns, and this is what all of heaven is waiting for, is then Christ returns. And we're going to hear the sound of the trumpet and the voice, behold, the bridegroom comes, go out to meet him. And there will be a marriage supper celebration that we're going to join in, those of us that are Christian, because we're going to experience the ultimate and final union of Christ and to the church, with which we are make up the bride of Christ. So listen, all of this is beautiful. All of this is a picture, hard words, hard language, and yet it's clear what God's design, desire, and plan is for you and I, and this beautiful expression of joy that God has given to us.